I have seen my Father's glory revealed in Jesus Christ, and the more that I behold him, the more he satisfies. When I gaze upon his beauty, when I see him as I should, then my eyes are lifted upwards, and here's the line, for his glory and my good. For his glory and my good. Recently, we've been looking at the Book of the Covenant, which was given by God to Old Testament Israel to help them to know how to put the Ten Commandments into practice in everyday life. And it began in chapter 20 and verses 22 to 26. And it began by focusing on God's worship with the first commandments in mind. It then moved on to explain some of the commands that concentrate on loving your neighbor. So commands like do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness. And now in chapter 23 and verses 10 to 19, as the book of the covenant begins to draw to a close, it has returned to the theme of God's worship. Why? Because God is passionate for his glory. His supreme delight is the praise and the adoration of his name. And so as he returns to the theme of his worship, at this time it's the fourth commandment which is in view. The fourth commandment which was given in Exodus 20 and verses 8 to 11. The commandment to keep the Sabbath day holy. The fourth commandment is important. It's the longest of the Ten Commandments. It's referred to in the Old Testament more than any of the other of the Ten Commandments. When God gave to Moses the stone tablets with the Ten Commandments on in Exodus 31, he said, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths. The first commandment, which is, you shall have no other God before me, it's the foundational commandment. It's the commandment on which all the other commands are built on. But perhaps it was Israel's attitude towards the fourth commandment and the keeping of the Sabbath day, which showed whether or not they were keeping the first commandment. As we live in the New Testament and this side of the cross and the resurrection, it is very clear that we don't keep the Sabbath with all of its rules and regulations in the same way that Israel did in the Old Testament. We meet together on the Lord's Day, and we recognize that the Lord's Day is not an exact replacement for the Sabbath. But that doesn't mean that what is said here is not relevant for us, far from it. And as we shall see, like all of the other commandments, the Sabbath command was given for the glory of God and for the good of his people. For the glory of God and for the good of his people. And it was as people honored God by keeping the Sabbath that they themselves were blessed. Now let's read the giving of the fourth commandment in Exodus 20 and verses 8 to 11. You'll find that on page 61. This passage was preached on a few years ago, and the sermon is on the website if you want to listen to it. Exodus 20 and verse 8, page 61. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the foreigner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now, as we come to Exodus 23 and these verses which build on the fourth commandment, you will see that this passage divides into two. And so we begin looking at verses 10 to 13 and Sabbath laws. Sabbath laws. And notice that these verses are not attempting to provide a full explanation of the Sabbath. And notice that their primary focus is on the blessing that the Sabbath will be to people when they keep it. with the big blessing that's emphasized being that of rest. The blessing of rest. You remember in Egypt, the people of Israel, they'd had no rest. They had harsh taskmasters who worked them to the bone, and God, in bringing them out, he wants to give them rest. And we see that in this day that he gives to them. I wonder, how good are you at resting? How good are you at resting? Some people are much better than others. For example, there was once a rich businessman who was disturbed to find a fisherman sitting enjoying the sun by his boat. "Why aren't you out there fishing?" he said. "Because I've caught enough fish for today," the fisherman responded. "Why don't you catch more than you need?" the rich man asked. "What would I do with them?" the fisherman said. "You could earn more money and buy a better boat. Then you could go deeper and catch more fish. You could buy nylon nets, catch even more fish, and make even more money. Soon you'd have a whole fleet of boats and be as rich as me." "Then what would I do?" the fisherman asked. "Well, you could sit back and rest," the rich businessman said. "What do you think I'm doing now?" the fisherman responded, as he looked placidly out to sea. How good are you at resting? Well, here we have God-given, God-shaped, and God-focused rest. In verses 10 and 11, drawing from the Sabbath principle of resting 1 in 7, as God, their landlord, looks forward to giving Israel the promised land of Canaan, he tells his future tenants that they are to work the land for 6 years, but in the 7th year, they are to let the land rest. And that's to be the ongoing pattern. And for 6 years, they are to sow, and they are to plant, and they are to harvest. But every 7th year, they are not to do any sowing, and not any planting, and no harvesting. And they are to just let the land be and let it rest. Yes, God had given them the land for their benefit, but in their need for food and in their desire for wealth, they are not to recklessly exploit the land. They are to care for the land, and they are to let the land rest. And what are they to eat in the 7th year? Well, in Leviticus 25, God said, "In the 6th year, I will give you such big harvests that you will have enough food for 3 years. Let the land rest," God says, "for I will take care of you. I will look after you. I am your faithful provider, and you can trust and have rest in me." So they were to let the land rest. And yet you notice verse 11 that the primary reason given here for letting the land rest was that it would be a special kindness to the poor. A special kindness to the poor, a special kindness to those who don't have any land for themselves. Why do I say that? Well, in letting the fields and the vineyards and the olive orchards rest, the poor in the 7th year were allowed to go onto your land and help themselves to whatever was growing by itself. So you imagine in the 7th year, and you're in your house and you're looking out of your window, looking over your land, and there's Mr. Poor in your field. And yet instead of gleaning or foraging at the edges of the field, as he's normally only allowed to do, he's in the middle of your field and he's digging things up and he's cropping things. And then you look over at your vineyard and there's Mrs. Hard Up, and she's in your vineyard. And instead of only picking up the grapes which have fallen to the ground, which that's normally only what she's ever allowed to do, she's actually picking grapes from your vines. And your immediate instinct is to shout, "Oi, stop it, get off my land." But no, you remember that you don't actually own the land. It's God who owns the land. He is your landlord, and you are simply his tenant. And this Sabbath year is one of God's ways of using the land to especially care for the poor. Life isn't all about your wealth and what you own. And in this 7th year, you are to allow the poor and even animals to take what they can. Why? Because God has a special heart for the poor. God has a special heart for the poor, and you are to have a heart for the poor as well. You think of what Paul says in 1 Timothy 6 to the rich, how you are to be kind and to be ready to share with others. God is our riches. God is our provider, not our land or our money or our investments. And there is rest in that. And yet, of course, this 1 year in 7, where the land was to be allowed to rest, it's based on the weekly pattern of resting 1 day in 7, verse 12. A weekly pattern that, as God explained in Exodus 20, is rooted in creation. As God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th day, so their weekly pattern was that they were to work hard for 6 days and then they were to rest on the 7th day. The word Sabbath means to cease. And that's what they were to do. They were to cease. On the 7th day, they were to cease their normal routine. They were to catch their breath. They were not to do any of their usual work. The farmer was not to plough their fields. The student was not to write their dissertation. And instead of this being something that they saw as frustrating and limiting them and holding them back, rather they were to see this as a gift from God and a blessing for them, the opportunity to rest, the opportunity to have refreshment. This weekly reminder that the world will keep going even when you're not working. This weekly reminder that not everything depends on you, and it's God who's in control, and you can trust him. This weekly reminder that there are some things more important than wealth or achievements. And this gift was given not just to them, but to the whole household as well, including servants and non-Jews. And you notice, if you look in verse 12, that even the animals were to be allowed to rest. The ox and the donkey. God is so kind and he's so caring that he even wants the working beasts to have a day off and to be refreshed. And this principle of 1 day in 7 being a day of rest, a principle that was rooted in creation before it was ever part of this law, this principle of 1 day in 7 being a day of rest, it still applies for us today. It's a creation pattern. You and I, we were not designed by God to work 7 days a week. It's not good for us. We can't cope with it. As limited and fragile human beings, we need rest. We were designed to need rest. Even Adam and Eve, before the fall, they rested 1 day in 7 on the Sabbath day. And you know, I suspect that some of the mental struggles and stresses that people have today is because they are ignoring this 1 day in 7 rest. Now, I know that the Sunday, the Lord's Day, is not an exact like-for-like replacement for the Sabbath. And I know that the Old Testament Sabbath, it was always a lot more than being just about physical and mental rest. It was primarily about worship. It was about remembering what God had done in creation and how he'd saved them from Egypt and all of his wonderful works. It was ultimately about resting in him. But as we look at these specific verses here, we're being shown the gift of rest that God gives. And is this something that you need to think about this morning? Rest doesn't mean inactivity. It doesn't give you an excuse just to be lazy. But do you need to think about the place of rest in your life? Are you always on the go? Do you never ever stop? Maybe it's with secular things. Maybe it's with things for the Lord. Have you ever thought through what's driving this desire to always be doing something and not resting? Is it where your identity is found? Is it what your relationship with God is based on? Are you too fearful of what people will say if you say, I actually can't do that? Is it a lack of trust in God and his control? Is it because you're trying to cram too many things into your life, things which at the end of the day are not actually that important? God cares for you. God, he cares for you, and he wants you to rest. He wants you to rest. Now, I think that this theme of rest carries over into this abrupt statement in verse 13, where God says that you need to listen to him and do what he says. How he is to be your God and you are to worship no other. And one of the things that makes God different to all the other gods, aside from the fact that they are false and he is not, is that it is God who gives rest. You see, when you get beneath the surface of every other god, what you find is that all they ever do is make you work. They say, if you want to go to heaven, you must work. If you want to be forgiven, you must work. If you want salvation, you must work. You must do this, you must do that. You must keep this command, you must fulfill this requirement or ritual. You must do all other religions say, and it's only God in Christ who says, it is done. It is done. You don't need to try and make up for the wrong things that you do. You don't need to try and atone for your sin. It's done. It's finished. In Christ, you're forgiven. In one of George Orwell's classic books, Animal Farm, the motto of Boxer, the old cart horse, is, I must work harder. I must work harder. And is that your motto as well? Tell me, what is the first thing you say when you sin? What is your very first response when you sin? Is this the first thing you say when you sin? I must work harder. I must do better. If that is your very first response when you sin, can I suggest to you that deep down you've slipped back into thinking that your relationship with God is based on what you do? Your relationship with God is not based on what you do, it's based on what Christ has done. And in that is rest. And that's one of the things that this Old Testament Sabbath was always pointing forward to. That's what we remember and we remind ourselves in and we rejoice in as we meet together week after week as God's people on the Lord's Day. We remind ourselves of the finished work of Christ and how the work of our salvation is complete and we can add nothing to it. It's done. Are you resting? Are you resting? Are you resting in the completed work of Jesus? Jesus, he said, come to me and I will give you rest. If you are someone who's not a Christian here this morning, there is no other place that you will find rest for your soul. And Jesus, he calls you to come to him and find rest. Find forgiveness of sins. Have your guilt and your shame taken away. Come to this place where there is no longer this endless cycle of trying to make up for what you've done. You can't do it. but it's been done for you. And in that there is rest. God is the God of rest. So in verses 10 to 13, you have Sabbath laws. But then in verses 14 to 19, the second part of this passage, there are annual feasts. There are annual feasts. There are three of them here in this passage. You have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, verse 15, which took place in the month of Abib, which in the Jewish calendar was the first month of the year. For us, it lands at about March or April time. Then there's the Feast of Harvest, verse 16, and this took place about May or June. And then there is the Feast of Ingathering, again verse 16, and this takes place about September, October time. Who was to attend the feast at the temple, verse 17? It was the men. This didn't mean that the women and children couldn't attend. They could attend. You find that in Deuteronomy 16 and verse 11 and onwards. But as the head of the households, the men are highlighted here to say that each household at least needs to be represented. Now, why does God talk about these feasts here? Well, each of these feasts involves special Sabbaths in addition to the normal weekly Sabbath that might fall within the period of the feast. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread, verse 15, began the day after the Passover and lasted for 7 days. And on the first day of the feast and on the seventh day of the feast, they were to hold a special Sabbath. And during this whole period, no one was to eat anything with leaven or yeast in it, as they remembered how Israel had to be ready to leave Egypt at a moment's notice, and how God had brought them out of Egypt and saved them from Egypt. These 7 days were to be an act of worship to God with its special Sabbaths and feast and offerings brought to him. And it was a feast that, with its connection to the Passover, pointed forward to Jesus leading his great exodus through the cross of people out of darkness and into light, rescuing people from their sin. Then there is the Feast of Harvest, verse 16. Or the Feast of Weeks, as it's called elsewhere. Or Pentecost, as the Greeks began to call it, with the word Pentecost meaning 50th. Calling it that because it took place 50 days after the Sabbath associated with the Passover. This was to be a one-day feast, and it was to be a special Sabbath. And on it, the first fruits of the wheat harvest were to be given to the Lord, recognizing him as the provider of the harvest and expressing trust in him for the harvest yet to come. And of course, this feast pointed forward to Acts 2 and to the day of Pentecost, when the Spirit was poured out on the church and 3,000 people were saved, and the first fruits of a global harvest were produced. And then there was the Feast of Ingathering, again verse 16. On the first day of this feast, they were to hold a special Sabbath. And then on the 8th day, the day after this feast had finished, they were to hold another special Sabbath. This was a feast that was held after the agricultural year had come to an end, and after all the harvest had been brought into the barn, and Israel, they thanked God for the harvest that he had provided. And of course, it points forward to the ultimate day when the Lord Jesus Christ would come back with the great spiritual harvest being finished and all God's saved people having been gathered in to God's barn. And then you have some further stipulations linked to the feasts in verses 18 and 19. So for example, verse 18, "You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice," that's primarily the Passover sacrifice, "with anything leavened." So that's connected to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So before the Passover lamb could be eaten, and before the Feast of Unleavened Bread had officially begun, people had to make sure that they had already removed all leaven from their houses, and now they were starting to eat things made without leaven. Why did they have to do this? Well, it was because it was an expression of how serious they were about these feasts and following God. The Passover lamb had to be eaten with sincerity and devotion. Paul in 1 Corinthians 5, he applies it to holiness within the church, the seriousness with which we are to take the Christian life. So if someone is saying, I'm trusting in Christ, my Passover lamb, that person is to be living a godly and holy life, a sincere life. And Paul says we need to remove the leaven of hypocrisy and evil. And we need to be the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Second half of verse 18. You shall not let the fat of my feast remain until the morning. Again, this refers to the Passover lamb that was eaten as part of the Passover meal, which had to be completely consumed on the night with none of it left over for the morning. And why does it single out the fat? Well, the fat for them would have been one of the best and the choicest parts of the meal. So when you have a meal, I don't know what your strategy is. We all have our own strategy. Do you leave the best parts of the meal till last and you eat the peas first? Or do you start with the best parts of the meal and you leave the peas till last? What's your strategy? Well, here God is saying, don't be tempted to keep some of the best bits until the next day so that you can enjoy them then. Because if you start doing that, you're just turning this feast into something which is about you and self-indulgence, rather than being about God-centered devotion. In verse 19, again, devotion to God is in view. At the Feast of Harvest, it's not just their first fruits they need to bring, but the best of their first fruits. And then you have this rather unusual command in the second half of verse 19. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. There are all sorts of reasons out there given as to why this might be here, but some people think that this is thought to be a pagan ritual and one that seems particularly heartless and cruel. And of course, we've already seen how God has a heart even for animals. Even working animals are to be given a day off, one day in 7. God has a heart even for animals. And God's people are to be different to the pagan nations. And they are to be merciful even to animals. But as we think about these 3 annual feasts and their special Sabbaths, doesn't it excite you and thrill you that thousands and thousands of years before it happened, before Christ and his cross and the day of Pentecost and the second coming of Jesus, these things were already being pointed forward to year after year after year in these annual feasts that were embedded in the Jewish calendar as they anticipated them. And why are they there? Well, because God is the Lord of history and he has a great plan of salvation. And even in this Old Testament Jewish calendar, they are being reminded that God has a plan. Of course, we are in a privileged position because we live in the period where 2 of these feasts have been fulfilled. We look back and we see the cross and we see the day of Pentecost, meaning that we now wait for the fulfillment of the final feast, when the great harvest of God's people will have been brought into God's barn and Jesus will return. These great feasts, they were to be woven into the rhythm of their lives. Every year they were being held. And what they represent is to be woven into the rhythm of our life. These three great events, two in the past, one in the future, they are to underpin the calendar of our lives. And I wonder if that's happening for you. Is your life just always about the surface things of life, the next dentist appointment, the birthday coming up, the holiday that you've booked? Or is it these three events that underpin everything? Calvary, Pentecost, the second coming of Jesus. And God, he gave the Sabbath and these feasts with their special Sabbaths for his glory and for the good of his people. And as we look at them through our New Testament eyes, we see that far more clearly than they ever could. And so are you allowing them to underpin the whole of your life? Because they glorify God and they are for the good of his people.